First up, we're going to talk about connective tissue, and this is that second hardest unit for students when they first learn histology. The main thing to note about connective tissue is that it is mostly matrix and very little cells. So previously, the tissues we talked about between epithelium, muscle cells, and neural tissue, that is all mostly cells and very little matrix. So we're flip-flopping the equation now. And so before we dive in, don't even worry about what type of tissue this is yet. I just want to take a look at a slide like this. So a lot of the connective tissue we look at is going to just look like a mass of fibers. Most of what we see is collagen. There'll be just a few cells interspersed, so you might not even see them based on how it's stained. And sometimes you'll see nuclei, so they appear a little darker here. But we're mostly concerned about fibers today. Collagen fibers. There'll be some other types like elastic fibers. So a lot of fibrous stuff and fluid and gel and just extracellular matrix. That is what we're talking about today. There are some special types of cells found in connective tissue. So these are called fibrocytes and fibroblasts. And the way to tell those apart is fibroblasts are going to be actively making new fiber. So they are making things, whereas fibrocytes are the mature version of the cell. So they're not doing a whole lot. They're just hanging out and kind of maintaining the fibrous tissue. Another thing to know about connective tissue is that it is very diverse. So we have stuff like this. We're going to see other connective tissue that looks completely different, and it has the same building materials, but it's just arranged in a totally different way. And a great example of this is actually if we look at skin, which is what's coming up next lab. So we've already talked about basement membranes and epithelium. That's what we see more superiorly in this slide. But if we dig a little deeper here, we start getting into connective tissue. And we have multiple types of connective tissue. So we'll talk about what these layers are called next lab, but just look at how much connective tissue there is deep to our epidermis. And it's so varied in shape and appearance. So a lot of today is just going to be sorting through this type of connective tissue and figuring out what all of these squiggles and things mean. So I don't expect you to have a total grasp on this by the end of the video. This is just practice with microscope slides. But we're going to do a lot more of this and keep practicing with it as we prepare for lab exam 1. So like I said with the epithelial video, modules are going to be your friend. So underneath our epithelium examples, we have connective tissue examples. So they're organized by category. We've got fibrous, supportive, and fluid connective tissue. So I know there are a lot of examples here, but that's to give you practice when you don't have microscopes in front of you. So I highly recommend going through most of these images. All right, so let's dive right in and talk about fibrous connective tissue. So fibrous connective tissue is kind of divided into dense and loose connective tissue. And so we'll talk about dense connective tissue first. So this connective tissue has an almost combed appearance depending on if we're talking about an irregular pattern or a regular pattern. So let's try to find both here using our handy dandy histology website. So dense regular connective tissue has a nice patterned appearance to it. It's wave-like. It might be a little squiggly depending on the location of the tissue and how it was prepared, but overall it's going to look like it was combed through. So it's nice and organized. And this is where the name comes from. So it's a dense tissue. There's not a lot of gaps per se in the fibers, and it has a regular pattern to it. Whereas if we compare that to irregular connective tissue, we've got fibers running in all different directions. And so this pattern is going to determine where we find these types of connective tissue. So dense regular connective tissue is found anywhere that we want a lot of tensile strength. So for example, ligaments and tendons. They typically have one attachment point, tendons attached to muscle, and they also attach to bone. So usually they'll have specific points of attachment and then they're being stretched along their length. Ligaments attach bone on bone, but it's going to be a similar concept. So we want a lot of tensile resistance so that our muscles don't detached from the tendon or from the bone, which is a very painful process. So tensile strength, dense regular connective tissue. Irregular connective tissue is found anywhere that we have a lot of forces in competing directions. And so we've got this irregular pattern because we have fibers going in all different directions. So anytime you have a membrane, we'll talk about things called aponeuroses, which is like a sheath of connective tissue, the deep layers of the skin, even the eyes themselves. These are going to be examples where we have a lot of forces in different directions. Just think about how stretchy your skin is and how you can pull it every which way. That's because we have dense irregular connective tissue in these areas. Okay. So a couple other examples that you might see dense connective tissue are going to be in arteries, and this has a specific name. So we call this type elastic connective tissue. So let's hop over to Yale here. So elastic connective tissue looks different. It's stained a little differently. So it's subtle on this slide, but we have a lot of great examples on Canvas, so I'll try to find some. But we are looking now for elastic fibers, which is different than the collagen fibers we've talked about previously. So elastic fibers are really squiggly. They look like really curly hairs, and they're usually darker stained. So it's subtle here, but you can see they're a darker purple than the surrounding tissue, and they're just squiggling their way along the slides here. So the presence of elastic tissue, elastic fibers, tells us that this is an elastic connective tissue. So this name refers to its function. Elastic connective tissue is really good at expanding and recoiling. So we're going to find this in the arteries, specifically the muscular walls of the arteries. We also find it in vocal cords. So the way vocal cords work is they vibrate back and forth really quickly to produce sound. And we need this elastic tissue to allow that expansion and recoil over and over and over again. One last place we'll see them is in the vertebrae. So elastic tissue helps to stabilize the vertebrae. We unfortunately don't have any slides or microscope slides showing that, but it's just a really cool relationship. So let's see if we can find some elastic tissue. Oh, and one important thing here. Elastic connective tissue is not the same as elastic cartilage. That trips a lot of students up. So we'll talk about cartilage. And it looks very different, but make sure you're not getting the terms mixed when you're trying to answer an exam question. Okay, so let's ignore the name of the slide here. I just want to show you some elastic fibers. So this slide has a really nice image of elastic fibers. And so we will not exclusively find them in elastic connective tissue, but that is going to be a great indication that we are talking about elastic connective tissue. So we're going to look in one more place here. The Human Protein Atlas will help us. We want to find arteries. Do we have examples of arteries here? No. Okay, so we are now going to go to Google because I want to show you an elastic artery histology slide. This is really important. So this is a big hint for Lab Exam 1, but one of the places where we find elastic tissue is in elastic arteries. So if you see a slide that looks like this and you think, hey, that's an elastic artery, that's probably a great indication that I'm asking you about elastic connective tissue. So here we can see a really dark squiggly boundary of the artery. This is specifically an elastic artery. So this is elastic tissue. If I indicated this on a slide, the answer would be elastic connective tissue. So pretty straightforward. It just takes practice working with examples. This is another great example. So we've got that darker stained elastic tissue. All right, moving on. So that was all dense connective tissue. We're going to talk now about loose connective tissue. So loose refers to the way it's organized. So the fibers are a lot less tightly woven together, so to speak. The type of fibers we would find here are mainly collagen, but there's another type of fiber called reticular fibers. They're basically a thin collagen fiber. So we're looking for really thick collagen fibers, and then those thinner guys. And you may also see some elastic connective tissue running through here. So I like this slide a lot because it shows all three of these types of tissue that you'll see in loose connective tissue. And generally, this kind of tissue is found around organs, actually, the specialized cells of organs. So this meshwork is going to form the infrastructure of organs. And so there's not a lot of examples that show it, but you can imagine this type of tissue in the soft internal organs. We have it around lymph nodes. Bone marrow is going to be an example. So we'll find this all over the body. But structurally, the three types of tissue we can see are we've got the thick collagen fibers in the background. We're going to have intermediate fibers, which are just basically tiny collagen fibers. So they'll have the same color as collagen fibers. And then we've got these really squiggly, dark, elastic fibers. So I love this slide because it shows all three. I have used it in the past on PowerPoint exams, so definitely pay attention to this one. Okay, so we have just a couple types of loose connective tissue. This type here is areolar connective tissue. So I guess one memory trick I use for it is I think of air. This is air-like because there's a lot of gaps between the tissue, so you could use that to help you. If you want to use an acronym for this, loose areolar connective tissue can be abbreviated to LACT. So acronyms are accepted on the lab exam. The other type of loose connective tissue is adipose tissue. So if we go back to modules here and find adipose tissue, this is fat cells. So adipose means fat. These guys store lipids. So most of what you see is actually a really large vacuole. And the way these cells work is the nucleus is squished to the side of the cell to make room for that storage unit for fat. So they're largely empty cells. And this is probably the weirdest connective tissue because it is mostly cells. So don't get it crossed with epithelium. This is still a connective tissue. So we're going to find it anywhere in the body that you store fat, which is all over. So that is adipose tissue. It's a great PowerPoint question because it's usually pretty easy for students to identify and distinguish from the other types of connective tissue. Okay, so that is all fibrous connective tissue. We're going to look now at supportive connective tissue. And we'll talk more about supportive connective tissue because this will come up when we talk about the skeletal unit. So the main types here are going to be the cartilage and bone. So there's not a lot of slides here for bone yet, but it'll come up again when we talk about the skeletal system. So today we're going to focus more on cartilage. So supportive connective tissue it's another tissue forming infrastructure in the body. Our cartilage and bone are going to form our skeletal system that helps keep our organs in place and helps us be able to move. So it's the muscles cross our joints, they attach to bones, and when they contract, joint actions are created. So those two systems work together to form the support of our body. So cartilage, again, is mostly matrix. In this case, the matrix is a little less gel-like. So it's more solid. It allows some movement, but it is going to support the body. So it needs to be more solid and resistant to external forces. We're going to see we have some special names for the types of cells we find here. And we have three types that we'll talk about: hyaline fibrocartilage and elastic cartilage. And then we'll have two types of bone, but again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on it today. So, first up, we have hyaline cartilage. So let's see. We're just going to open up our links here so they're ready to go. Hyaline cartilage is the most distinct. So, some of the things you'll see in all of the cartilage we talk about are these cells called chondrocytes. So chondro, the prefix here means cartilage, cyte means cell, so these are cartilage cells, and they are housed within a structure called the lacunae. And together they form this they almost look like cartoon eyes. Lacunae are lighter stained, and then the chondrocytes are going to be really dark in appearance. So it's almost like a pupil in an eye. So we'll see that pattern in all of the cartilage that we talk about. Hyaline cartilage is the most common, so we'll see it in things like your nose, at the ends of long bones. We'll see some cartilaginous joints between the ribs and the sternum. And then another place we see it is in the trachea and the bronchi and that whole respiratory system. So let's try to find an example here. This is of the bronchus. And just like a lot of the organs we look at, this is going to be a combination of tissues. So it'll have epithelium, it'll have loose connective tissue, but it'll also have cartilage. So let's scroll down here. And it is, of course, nicely labeled for us. So as we get closer here, you can start to pick out the types of tissue. So we can bring everything together here. We've got mucosa, we've got epithelium, lining a lumen. We've got a muscle layer, so this is likely smooth muscle. We have a submucosa made of connective tissue, and then we have our cartilage, our supportive connective tissue. So if we zoom in here, we can start to see that pattern of lacunae housing chondrocytes. So the light areas are lacunae, chondrocytes are going to be the darker stained cells. We'll circle around to this concept again when we talk about the skeletal system, because there is a process in which bone is formed from cartilage called endochondral ossification. It's a mouthful, but we'll see some of that in slides like this, and I'll talk a little more about how we find those areas. Okay. So functionally, hyaline cartilage is going to help reduce friction at joints, and as we just saw, it also helps support our air passageways. So you can actually palpate the cartilage in your bronchus. You can palpate your esophagus, that whole area. So your esophagus is going to be part of the gut tube, but we also have the trachea, which sits in front of it, and you can actually run your fingers along that and feel the hyaline cartilage supporting it. Okay, so next up, we have fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage it's a little more fibrous, hence the name, and it is going to be for heavier wear and tear. So we're going to find this in places of really heavy wear and tear, like between the vertebrae and at joints like the symphysis pubis, between our pubic bones. So we're talking a lot of weight, a lot of movement all the time, so we need a little more support than we would get from hyaline cartilage. So it looks a little different. The way I would describe the pattern we see here is like peas in a pod. So we have kind of these columns or stacks of chondrocytes in darker purple, interspersed between matrix and fibrous fibers, essentially. So we've got these really long fibers here, and then poking out we have our chondrocytes. So that one is pretty easy to distinguish. And then our last type of cartilage is going to be elastic cartilage. And whoa, does this one look different. So usually elastic cartilage is going to be darkly stained because elastic stuff in general shows up as dark on slides. So we're talking again about elastic fibers, so make sure you don't get this confused with elastic connective tissue. So elastic cartilage is going to have a more flexible framework. So we would expect to see this in the ear. You can kind of fold your ears over themselves, but when you release them, they retain their original shape. So that is due to the elastic cartilage we find there. Another place is the epiglottis. So again, we're not going to talk about that for a while, but when we talk about the respiratory system and the nasopharynx area, we'll see the epiglottis come back. And then lastly, the place we find this, we'll find a little bit in the cartilage of the larynx. So again, it's part of that vocal apparatus that allows us to produce speech. Main thing to look for here is those really dark elastic fibers. We have the same pattern as in the other two cartilages where we've got chondrocytes housed in lacunae. So that's the third time that concept's come up. So it's likely to appear on a lab exam. Okay. Now we're going to talk about bone, just briefly. Remember, we're going to come back to it. But for today, I just want to talk about our one slide here, compact bone. So we actually have two types of bone, spongy versus compact. They are both supportive connective tissue, and they actually have a lot of collagen fibers in them. So they look pretty different and they feel pretty different than the other types of connective tissue, but they still are made of similar materials. So spongy bone, let's go ahead and pull up an image here. Spongy bone is going to be found kind of at the end regions of long bones in an area called the epiphysis. So don't need to know that yet. Again, we'll come back to it. Let's look up some histology here. And then compact bone is kind of everything else that we see. Okay, spongy bone. Let's find a nice labeled one. So spongy bone is actually really tricky for students because of the way it is stained. So spongy bone has red marrow, and then it has little beams of bone called trabeculae. And what we see on a slide is that the bone marrow is actually the lighter stuff. It's not the pink, it's not the red, it's actually the lighter area here. The spongy bone is in pink. And we'll look at a model that'll make this make more sense. But we can tell this is bone because we see lacunae housing chondrocytes. I misspoke there. We have osteocytes when we talk about bone. So osteo means bone, cyte means cell. So we still have lacunae, but in this case we refer to bone cells as osteocytes. So that's how we can tell that this is actually the bone rather than matrix. And the matrix, the marrow, I'm speaking a lot, I apologize, rather than the marrow. So we'll look at some slides like that, make sure you know how to identify it under a microscope. So if we look at an unlabeled slide now, to review, we have the pink here, which is our actual spongy bone. And we can start to see why these are called trabeculae. So the Latin definition for trabeculae means little beam. So we have these little beams of bone projecting out, and this network creates a spongy appearance. And then in between here, we have our red marrow, which is not actually red on a microscope slide. So make sure you don't get those confused. Okay, compact bone is a little easier. So compact bone is going to be organized in these units called osteons. So what we're looking at right now is one osteon. It's almost like the rings of a tree. So you can think of a cross section of the trunk of the tree, like we're looking down on it. That trunk, the entire tree, is the osteon, and then we're going to have these concentric rings inside the osteon. And those concentric rings are called, I misspoke there, the concentric rings here are going to be like the tree rings, and then we're going to have these little networks here called canaliculi, running perpendicular to the tree rings. In the middle here we have a central canal, and we'll talk more about that in Lab 5 and what all of these things mean. But for now, all you need to be able to do is recognize that this is compact bone. So compact bone looks like tree rings, and then we have our spongy bone, which has those trabeculae, those little beams. Okay, last up, we have one more category of connective tissue, and it's just one type. So it's really easy. It's fluid connective tissue, and fluid connective tissue is blood. It's weird to think of blood as a connective tissue, but structurally, it's going to be mostly a lot of matrix, or in this case, we call it plasma, and then we have lots and lots of cells here. So let's break this down. This is what you will see under a microscope at about 40x, and we do have two types of blood smears that we'll look at. Everything in white you see, this is like the background of the slide. This is plasma. So plasma in this case is going to be transparent, but I could ask you it if I pointed to one of these spaces here in white. Most of what you see on the slide will be red blood cells. And in this case, they are stained as we would expect them to be. They are going to be these kind of blank cells. And the reason for that is red blood cells don't have nuclei. They don't have a lot of organelles at all because they're mainly transporting things. You will also see white blood cells. Do you need to know that for lab exam 1? The answer is no. We're not going to talk about those until pretty far into the semester. What I do want you to recognize, though, are platelets. So in between our red blood cells, we have these tiny dark purple fragments, and there is a good picture of this in the PowerPoint as well. So these fragments are going to be platelets. So in terms of what I might ask you on lab exam 1, I want you to know plasma, red blood cells, and platelets, and that's it. And that covers our connective tissue. So it is a lot. Use the table in your worksheet to help you, and then look at all of these examples on Canvas because they're going to give you a lot of practice identifying microscope slides and looking at histology.